चैलेंजेस आए, देश में उन चैलेंजेस को मैनेज करने के लिए क्या एफर्ट किए गए, क्या हमारी वो लर्निंग्स हैं जो देश के लिए और दुनिया के लिए भी.
Also listening, so you speak English.
Sir. So, sir, IFC team, sir, I would like to thank IFC team for taking up this independent study on identifying what are the challenges, what are the efforts which have been taken up at national level, what are the learnings which could be useful for not only India and for the world at large, and the success stories through the two reports, sir. Report 1 talks about India's vaccine development story, sir. Vaccine कैसे develop हुई, sir. Report 2 talks about India's vaccine administration journey, कि उसका वैक्सीन का एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन कैसे किया गया, सर. सर, रिपोर्ट का जो ग्लिम्स हमें पता लग पाया, सर, उसमें मुख्यतः मेनली व्हाट हैज बीन highlighted is that it is attributed to the political will at the highest level and meticulous planning which has been done at all levels so that we are able to ensure last mile administration of vaccine in India, sir. And sir, while we would request Mr. Amit Kapoor to give a detailed presentation on the report, sir, and also, sir, they have also brought copies of the report for wider distribution today, sir. But I would like to highlight, sir, primarily because from Ministry of Health perspective, we have been undertaking this task under your guidance, under Honorable Prime Minister, sir, guidance, sir, that this vaccination journey started from public perspective on 16th of January, but the efforts were initiated much earlier to that, sir. And we achieved 1 billion doses administration on 21st of October last year in only a small period, 279 days, sir. India has actually created a success story in terms of ensuring that we deliver 2.5 crore doses in a single day. I think that was the tribute every vaccinator in the country paid to Honorable Prime Minister on his birthday, sir. And sir, we have been actually continuing with this approach in terms of ensuring that 69.42 lakh vaccine doses were administered even in the month of January this year also, sir. Sir, we had, under the guidance of the technical groups, launched adult beneficiaries as well as now the young adolescent population administration also, sir. We had covered 97% people with first dose in this country, which is 2.75 times the population of United States and 6.29 times the population of Russia, sir. Similarly, in terms of second dose also, we have covered 81% of beneficiaries, eligible beneficiaries in this country, which is 3.5 times the population of country as big as Brazil and 11 times as big as population of UK, sir. Sir, we had launched 15 to 18 vaccine administration, wherein also we had covered 72% of eligible people. We've also launched precaution dose, primarily for healthcare workers, frontline workers, as well as elderly people with comorbid conditions above 60 years of age. And we had already covered 1.94 crore doses within that also, sir. So today, sir, this is also a very positive occasion, sir, because of the consistent effort done by healthcare worker, frontline worker, and the containment staff across the country. We are now experiencing a decline in the cases in the present surge also, sir. I would really, through you and on behalf of you, sir, would like to thank all the stakeholders who have ensured that we are able to manage this third surge of cases, which was fueled by Omicron, sir. And also, sir, all the vaccine manufacturers, vaccinators, and all administrators at field level, sir, who have been supporting this cause of saving precious lives, sir. With these introductory remarks, sir, I would request Institute of Competitiveness, which is an affiliate of Harvard Business School, for a detailed presentation of the independent study which has been taken by them, sir.
Good afternoon, Jeet. Thank you. Honorable Minister, thanks a lot for the opportunity and presenting us the opportunity to document this. I'd also like to place my special thanks to Love Agarwal ji for giving us all the information that was desired and understanding as to how this whole response is really garnered and kept pace. So just quickly, I'll just go through my presentation. I'll not take more than 5 to 7 minutes. That's the time that has been allocated to me. So very quickly, Institute for Competitiveness is the LinkedIn knot in the global network of the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness at Harvard Business School. We are part of the competitiveness group, and we work very closely with Professor Michael Porter. And we are doing some extensive work on India with Mike at the helm, wherein we are actually trying to look at India's competitiveness. We are looking at the India competitiveness roadmap at 100 and so on and so forth. And of course, you would recollect, sir, that Professor Michael Porter was here in India as for the special NEETI lecture, wherein he had the chance of meeting the Honorable Prime Minister as well. So that is what we are. And just quickly moving ahead, I'm the chair for the Institute for Competitiveness, and I'm also the visiting scholar and lecturer at Stanford University. So it's absolutely an honor to really work on this. So what I really wanted to share was the whole effort that the government of India has actually done. Again, this was more from a documentation perspective to really understand what were the great things that have happened. And as Loveji had said, that it was an idea to understand how we can learn from the steps that we have taken to really see how we can tackle the future pandemics. It was an exceedingly important idea to really create a toolkit or an understanding. So this is the documentation effort. As we move along, we are going to be presenting a toolkit as well as we move forward. Then, of course, as everybody knows, COVID was something that happened in 2020. It just took the world by storm. The question was that how India was tackling it. And there were some huge positives, as I see. Of course, every country had its challenges. India had its share of challenges. But I think there is something remarkable that has actually happened, and that was in terms of seeing how steps were taken. From my point of view, there was a very huge integration of and commitment from the top, which led to something very remarkable here. Of course, this was the chronology of the COVID emergence. It started very early on, but I think what really did happen was that the government of India started noticing all this in the early days of the onset of the virus. The first meeting, as I understand, happened as way back in December of 2020 to really see what was happening. So the response was very quick. The whole government system really started working towards that system. And then, of course, the top 5 nations that were facing the maximum outbreak were countries like, of course, US, then Italy was at the forefront, and so on and so forth. This data is there, but we really wanted to document this to understand what is happening. But here comes one of the most positive things. If you really look at all the vaccine coverage that has happened across the world, there are rotavirus is 35%, tuberculosis is 89%. But what matters here is that at the scale and speed at which adult vaccination for COVID-19 happened, this is a historical effort of sorts. Like India was really able to take it forward. There were some other countries which have tried to do this, but I think at the top of the heap, from my understanding, would be that India did a historical effort to really cover the number of people who have been covered until now. And of course, if you really look at the adult vaccination coverage, there were challenges for the government, which they have really taken care of as we were really moving ahead. But one of the foremost things that I come to my mind was the development process for the vaccine. Typically, vaccine development cycle takes about 10 years. But what happened here was that how we were able to really crunch that into a very quick 1-year cycle, which included creating the manufacturing processes to really moving ahead. So what did happen was this was not something which was not embedded in science. It was deeply embedded in science and research that you were able to do everything together. It was a process which was run parallelly, and that is where we see the story of vaccine development. Something very quickly, when COVID-19 vaccine development had to happen, the first meeting happened in 2020 or early 2020 itself. And this shows a very preemptive move. In fact, India was one of the very few countries which was talking about vaccine development very early on during the onset of the disease. And if you really look at it, it was actually a movement or that was created wherein a lot of people were getting involved. It was not a single person effort. It was a multi-player, multi-stakeholder effort that we could see. Of course, DBT played a key role here. In fact, that is where the Ministry of Health and DBT were working for creating the vaccine. And then there was a license that was granted. And a lot of players were there, but there were 2 very critical players that you do see that did emerge. One was, of course, Serum, that was Covishield, and then Bharat Biotech, which was Covaxin. That did happen out of this. And very important that India did align itself with the world. Because if you really look at the science and how things were happening, India did align itself to the world to really create that vaccine. There was a lot of knowledge transfer. If you really look at it, this was an effort which showcased India's scientific capability. Because a lot of people will always criticize that the R&D capacity for the country or whatever, but this is where India did show to the world that this is something huge, that we can actually talk about science and we can be at the forefront of how we really develop the solutions. And Covaxin is actually a reflection of that very, very clearly. And then, of course, the COVID vaccine development timeline, it was a rapid development process. I'll leave the slides for you, but I'll quickly move through all this information. But the most important here is that how this timeline was really looked at. From 11th March to 2022, where you get approvals, which was very, very quick. And there was no reason to really say that there was something wrong with the vaccine or whatever. The results were absolutely impeccable. And we have already seen that. In fact, I would like to just say one thing, that if you really look at the present wave, the success for India is actually embedded in science, because what we have really been able to achieve is the administration that has actually happened for the vaccine. Then this is very important here again. That was the NEGVAC structure and governance mechanism. Again, an integrated approach. 19 key ministries were involved here. In fact, I had a chance of interacting with many people within the ministry, within various players who were here to really document this effort. But I must say that this was a ship which had a very strong rudder, but of course, which was moving things in the right direction. But it would not have happened without that rudder. But I think it is just about that integrated effort that moved. So it is scientific approach to vaccine administration. Then, of course, the administration was the key. A lot of things would really be said in terms of like how this approach was set, again, deeply embedded in science, as to how the beneficiaries were chosen, whether it should be the young people or the old people or the vulnerable people or how it should happen. I think it was, again, something which was deeply looked at, what I call conversion, talking to who or talking to various players within the government of India to see who are the set of people who should be really looking at this. And then, of course, the administration started with the healthcare workers, which was exceedingly important because if you really look at it, if we did not get this right, things would have actually been very different. But this is something that we really did get right. And then as we moved ahead, it moved to Ministry of Defense, to various people across the board. And then we roll out for phase 2, phase 3, and now we are continuing with that. But there's something very important, and that was about COVID. I think technology did play a very strong role in terms of like how vaccine administration needs to happen. If you really look at it, like India was possibly the first country which said that we will actually create a platform which is able to understand what is really happening. And I think this is a good case in point, which should be replicated across the world, that how we can actually use technology. It had its own skirmishes, not that it did not have its own what I call negatives or whatever, but what really did happen was that how we were able to move ahead and really quickly administer and understand what was happening. If you really look at this, you would have heard of cases when people were not even sure outside of India that when are they eligible for a second dose. But for us in India, we actually knew it from that platform itself that we are eligible for that second dose. We would get that information. And it was something very impeccable, the large data that was going on to understanding this. Of course, there was a COVID platform, the process flow that we've understood, and how to really tackle this. The one more important thing was that there was a whole huge vaccine hesitancy or eagerness that happened. So it had to be really managed very, very well. So it was about really creating an ecosystem for information dissemination. And you would have also seen that there were huge negatives from people outside. There was hesitancy or there's something wrong with it. But how did the effort really happen to really move people into the right direction? So this was a communication strategy. How it was looked at as crisis communication, capacity building, the war room, or what you would call as the how information was being disseminated, etc. And then there were key stakeholders, and there were various sets of people who were involved here. Again, it was something very important to really understand that it's an ecosystem approach that was followed across the board, and key platforms where everybody was actually involved here in the communication bit. But very clearly, if you really look at the vaccine drive, there have been huge developments to this effort. And as Lav Agarwalji was sharing some recent data as to what is the coverage, that is a great accomplishment. But I think one of the major things that I did see, that there was a whole huge push from the top in terms of really seeing how this has to be managed. I think it is very easy to criticize, but I think this is an effort where I feel that it is a positive thing that has actually happened and how we have been able to manage. So this is where I'll stop my presentation, and thanks for the opportunity, Honorable Minister and Lavji. Over to you. So can I now request Michael Green, my colleague, who's sitting in London, who is the CEO for the Social Progress Imperative. In fact, Michael is a close associate for Professor Michael Porter. In fact, they developed the Social Progress Index together. In fact, in 2017, Mike was here for the Niti lecture, where he shared his views with the Honorable Prime Minister as well at that time. But Michael, over to you. I know you've seen the report, and what do you think, and what are your insights here? Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amit. Good afternoon, Minister, honored guest. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And let me begin by congratulations on the report, which I read with great fascination. Social Progress Imperative has worked in many countries around the world on the COVID response. And so my remarks are going to be sort of focused on what I took from the report based on what we've seen in various places. And essentially, the first piece is around the science. And I mean, maybe I think one point I really want to make up front about the science is, of course, the science that we developed around the world to create vaccines was based on fundamental science that was investment of many, many decades. Hundreds of PhDs that have been granted for research that had apparently no practical application is the foundation on which this vaccine technology has been developed. So a fundamental investment in science, and I think India's capacity in science is part of that story. But then obviously the report outlines in great detail about how India was able to harness the science, harness the technology, and turn that into an incredibly aggressive vaccine development strategy, which is a sort of huge accomplishment. So the vaccines are clearly a big part of the story. But the science can only ever be part of the story. Because, there's the old joke that if you ask a physicist, why did the chicken cross the road? They will say, well, first let's assume that it's a massless chicken, spherical chicken in a vacuum. It's when science meets the real world that the complexities begin. And I think the report also stretches into some of these areas, not just about developing the technology of the vaccines, but how do you distribute them? And what we've seen from our work around the world is how that human factor is such a critical part of it. One piece is the idea around vulnerabilities. We are not equally vulnerable to the COVID virus. Some of us are more vulnerable in terms of risks of illness and even mortality. And therefore, we need to have vaccination strategies that take into account those varied risks. And that was well described in the report, how India has done this. Then the other piece is behavior. And we did some work with a number of governments around the world using social media data to understand people's movements. Because, of course, the more movement you have, the more interaction you have, the greater your risk of infection. And so, for example, we found that in my home city of London, the people, in a sense, in the more affluent parts of West London who worked in offices could very easily retreat to their office, retreat to their home office, work from home, not interact with anyone. Whereas other people who were working in frontline health services or other essential services in perhaps poorer parts of London were actually interacting with other people a lot more prone to live in multiple occupancy households. So understanding those social dynamics is absolutely critical in developing your vaccination strategy. You want to target the most vulnerable, but you've also got to think about those modes and directions of transmission. And again, I was looking at the way that the sort of frontline workers in a whole range of ways were prioritizing the vaccination strategy. Seemed to be a very smart thing to do, given their role, their interactions, the potential vulnerability they had, and the role they had in transmission. So that was a kind of a key part of this story. But I think the other thing we cannot forget about this story in India is the scale, as we heard in the opening remarks. I mean, the only country of comparable scale is, of course, China. And what China did in terms of a zero COVID policy was unimplementable virtually anywhere else in the world. So what India has been trying to do is manage this fluid situation at a scale, an unprecedented scale. And so the ability to manage that through this balanced approach around the rapid acceleration of vaccines, delivering those vaccines to in the right prioritized way, delivering those effectively, while also managing other mitigation measures, and also communicating the need for vaccines. I think we're all being concerned around the world around the issue of vaccine hesitancy. And what we've seen in some of our research in different countries is that vaccine hesitancy isn't just about people not believing in COVID or thinking it's all about mobile telephones, that some people have legitimate reasons for being concerned about vaccinations. We did research in Costa Rica, and we found that nearly a third of respondents said, I'm not going to get vaccinated because I think it'll be better for someone else more than me. So actually, there was an altruistic reason for doing so. So this is why the need to have very sophisticated communication campaigns is so important to win people over. And doing that at scale in a country the size of India, the complexity of India, is a considerable achievement. So my final thought is to say thank you again for this report, a chance to be part of this discussion. It's a really valuable report, which enormous lessons to the world. But also, most importantly, Minister, my congratulations to you, to your colleagues in government, and particularly to the frontline workers who've been leading this effort, where India really, really has set an extraordinary example for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. Absolutely a delight to hear your views. In fact, I have my colleague, Mark Esposito, who is from Harvard University. He teaches there and also at the Harvard Business School. So, Mark, if you have any request for your views, I'm sure you've really reviewed the report, you've read it. So over to your remarks, Mark.
Thank you very much. First of all, good afternoon, Honorable Minister. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to share our thoughts. Good to see also my good friend Michael and, of course, Dr. Amit. We do share a journey that now is over a decade at Harvard Business School. So that's something nice to see, that the legacy continues in our share passions and contribution. I also want to congratulate for the release of the report and start from where Michael has actually ended. At the very beginning of the pandemic, we tended to celebrate countries that were doing great progress in terms of managing the challenge. But many of these countries were small. I remember I was based in the UAE at the time, and we were looking at the rate of vaccination growing. We were also celebrating how quickly Israel was going. The reality is these are countries that don't even have a comparable complexity with India. So as much as we appreciate the efforts within the context of reference, it is on India, on country like India, that we really have the testing ground on our ability as society to address important challenges. So first of all, I would say India did not only address a national crisis, it generated a blueprint for the understanding that large-scale problems like this can be managed, regardless of your size, if the right components are in place, which is a combination of culture, determination, and I would say technology. Now, technology is, of course, a collective design, is a design, an extension of the brain, if you want to say. It doesn't necessarily as an operating principle on its own. But what really impressed me of the effort that also are emerging from the report is the fact that, as we've been hearing more and more, COVID has been an accelerant, an echo chamber, a catalyst. What has COVID-19 been for India? In my humble opinion, it has been a trampoline towards a country that is moving into technology-driven output. And let's try to understand what it means. A country that starts blending science, culture, the normal level of solidarity with technology is a country that is able to address important challenges at a fraction of the time. They have a natural form of scaling because technology, different from the physical world, allow us to digitize coding that naturally becomes available around the world. I was impressed when I heard that from the first time a company, for example, like Moderna, received the DNA of COVID-19 to the first prototype, only a few hours had actually passed. It shows you that the opportunity we really have today to think of COVID as the very beginning of an era where we address an important challenges can really start by having India as a pioneering country in that sense. So I really see this not only in terms of the success story of how we managed this crisis, but more importantly, and one of the things I learned in another government assignment, what's the next crisis and are we ready for it? The answer is not in terms about preparedness, because sometimes these shocks are coming without any form of warning. But it's more about whether we have built a responsive mechanism that is able to think of shocks, not in terms of a specific single unit, but more as a set of responses that are behaviorally driven, supported by technology, but equally politically cohesive. And I think what the government has really been able to demonstrate is all of this at the same time. I believe India has been a country that has embraced the concept of the fourth industrial revolution, even prior to COVID-19. Probably today, India is in the fourth industrial revolution in the thinking, which is probably one of the more, I would say, acclaimed success we need to celebrate in understanding that when we're using technology to augment humans, when we're using technology to improve quality of life, when we're using technology to advance on multiple fronts, So when we're augmenting humans rather than augmenting markets, we fundamentally are moving into the right direction on the premise of the technology opportunity that we have today in addressing some of the challenges ahead of us. Why do I talk in terms of the future? We are clearly a more connected world than ever before. We're not converging, unfortunately. We are still diverging, but convergent divergence can be eventually become a movement of reconciliation towards common principles. What is important is to understanding that our systemic opportunities and our systemic risks are there. This interwoven nature of our society requires countries like India to take the lead in showing how a complex system can really thrive and move forward. And so that's why today is really about the celebration of what you've been able to achieve as a country. I do remember when in the very first stages, there was a sense of loss and understanding what will be next. So it's remarkable to see what came out of that sense of anxiety and incredible orchestrated effort that really has improved the quality of life of millions. I encourage and urge you also, Honorable Minister, to inspire other countries to use the combination that India has been able to pivot to understand that challenges are not necessarily bad or good. They're opportunity for us to thrive and move us to the next level. Hopefully, we can inspire other countries to move towards what is the right level of responsiveness. And I think the report can be a blueprint on, first of all, the historical legacy of that journey, but equally on the opportunity moving forward. So I wish you all successes. I was very proud to read the report, proud to also know some of the people who are behind the report, and particularly proud to be a friend of the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. In fact, I'll take this opportunity to say that, in fact, my new book with Mark is getting published by Cambridge on Fourth Industrial Revolution. So some of the ideas you shared here are very pertinent. Right. But thanks a lot for both of you, Mark and Michael, to join. But I'll just hand over the floor to Love Agarwalji.
Thank you, Amitji, and all the colleagues from Mr. Green as well as also Mr. Mark. I think your comments and your overall framework which you put across was very, very comforting. And as you rightly mentioned, Mr. Mark mentioned that the whole approach was behavioral driven, supported by technology and driven by political will. I think you very aptly summed the whole thing up. And equally important is the point you mentioned that this is also the efforts taken in terms of vaccination is also celebration of what India has been able to achieve and what lies in store for India for future in terms of taking that leadership. So I think this has very aptly come out, and may we kindly request Mr. Amit Kapoor if you can kindly hand over the report by the Institute to Honorable Minister, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. It's the kind of it.
Sir, we know that we could not take your time to brief the report in greater detail, but a small presentation has also been given. And I think as Mr. Mark did mention, celebration of India's vaccination journey, sir. If we can hear some guidance from you, please.
Thank you. The team of Institute of Competitiveness, Harvard. I'm happy to receive this report from very competent team. And I am sure that this report would have Harvard expert exact fact and figures. This report and the comments in it are very big surprise for me. But I will definitely go through this report and will give my comments and feedback to the Institute. I am sure that this report will help the fellow citizen and the world to understand India's vaccine journey and the fighting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And sir, with your permission, they also wanted to distribute a copy of this report to all our colleagues from media who are present here, sir. So we request them to distribute it. And I would also like to thank Honorable Minister, sir, and for sparing his time today for this action with the Institute of Competitiveness, Harvard University, sir. And We would look for other details. As you said, this documentation is also highlighting the journey, the learning, sir, and these learnings will help not only India presently, but also for future also, sir. And as has already been brought out, it also shows India's leadership in so many ways in this whole approach, sir, of a country of size and complexity of India, sir. We would also, on your behalf, I would like to thank Institute of Competitiveness, Mr. Amut Kapoor, and the team for their mammoth effort spanning over the last few months to compile the overall journey and come up with these two sets of reports. Thank you, sir, and thank you, Mr. Amut.
Thank you, Dev. Thanks a lot, Dev. It's an opportunity. It's a pleasure for us to be really contributing as the Institute for Competitiveness, which is part of the MOC network at the Harvard Business and Institute for Competitiveness and Strategy. Thank you.
Thank you.
रिपोर्ट दिखा देंगे
एक दो क्वेश्चन भी ले लें